Have you ever witnessed someone nearly dissolving into a blizzard, with nothing left but a pair of burning eyes clinging to life? Picture a frail body, bare feet bleeding against the white snow, breath bursting like smoke into the dark night, arms reaching towards the faint flicker of light spilling from a lonely cabin window. That isn't a scene from a movie. That's the brutal truth of the frontier. And if you want to know what happens when death itself waits just outside the door, stay with me. Before this story begins, don't forget to hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because every word you leave behind is a spark of warmth that keeps this tale alive one more time. The wind roared across the Mogollon Ridge, driving snow in heavy waves that swallowed the sky. The world above wasn't blue, wasn't even gray, just a suffocating sheet of steel-colored light pressing down on the earth, making anyone who stood in it feel small, exposed, and utterly alone. Nothing human stirred in that frozen wilderness, only the brittle knock of branches and the brittle crack of ice breaking loose from the cliffs. Caleb Hartley, 35 years old, stood at the low fence line in front of his cabin. His fist tightened around the handle of an axe, broad shoulders hunched inside his coat, but still unable to shut out the cold that crept into his bones. Caleb wasn't the kind of man to flinch easily. He'd survived war, looked death in the face more than once. But this kind of cold was different. It didn't charge at you like a battlefield. It slid under your skin, slow, relentless, carving away at you piece by piece until it stripped you hollow. The cabin behind him was nothing more than a weather-beaten shack of dark pine logs. One window had been boarded up after last year's storm. No laughter came from within anymore. No woman's touch, no child's cry. His wife, Anna, had died 8 years ago from fever down in Silver Creek. His son, Samuel, barely made it through his second winter. After burying them, Caleb cut ties with the rest of the world. He built this place for silence. He survived. But he no longer lived. That was when he heard it. Something his ears, long trained to the stillness, couldn't ignore. Footsteps. At first, soft as a rabbit in the brush, then broken, uneven, staggering. Caleb's grip tightened on the axe, eyes scanning the swirling curtain of snow. Out here, strange sounds were rarely good news. A drifter, a thief, maybe worse, a prospector or outlaw with murder in his eyes. But then the shape appeared through the storm. Not a man, a woman. Her hair was black, long, braided, tangled with ice. Her buckskin dress was ripped to shreds, the hem flapping in the wind. Bare feet sank into the snow, leaving crimson patches behind with each step. Her arms clutched across her chest as if letting go would mean death itself stepping in. Caleb froze where he stood. The cold gnawed at him, but the uncertainty cut deeper. An Apache woman. Alone, no one came this far into white territory. Barefoot in the middle of winter, unless something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. She stumbled forward a few more steps, then collapsed to her knees. Her hands clawed at the drift, body swaying on the edge of collapse. When she lifted her face, he saw cracked lips move, heard a whisper dragged raw from her throat. "Please." 2 syllables. But they struck Caleb like a church bell in an empty canyon. He'd promised himself he wouldn't interfere with anyone's life again. Solitude was the only way to survive. But here, in the storm, lay a woman on the verge of death, a flickering candle that could be snuffed out by one more breath of wind. He scanned the tree line, listening. No riders, no voices, no ambush, only the storm. This wasn't bait. This was despair, naked and real. And Caleb knew better than anyone no human being deserved to die alone in the snow. He stepped forward slowly, axe still in his hand, but with something shifting inside him. When he bent down and lifted her into his arms, her body felt light as smoke, fragile as paper. Her eyes fluttered shut, but for the briefest moment he caught it one last glimmer of hope. Faint, but alive. Caleb pushed the door open with his boot. The hinges groaned, and a rush of heat spilled out like a soft blow to the face. He stepped inside, carrying the woman in his arms, and laid her down on the wool rug in front of the fire. Her body was shockingly light, as if one hard gust of wind could have carried her away. The flames crackled in the hearth, throwing restless shadows across the cabin. Smoke-stained walls, shelves bare but practical, a tin of salt, a jar of honey, a rifle hanging on the wall. Nothing wasted, nothing pretty. Just enough to keep a man alive. Caleb went to his cot, tore loose the thickest blanket, and came back to wrap it around her frame. She shivered, eyes half open, breath shallow and thin. Caleb crouched and pulled her bare feet into his hands. They were swollen, cracked, bleeding in places, frostbite biting deeper with every hour. If she'd stayed outside, they'd have frozen solid by morning. He dragged the basin closer, poured warm water from the kettle, and worked a cloth across her toes with steady, deliberate hands. She didn't cry out. She just trembled. Her face stayed tense, like someone bracing for judgment. Caleb said nothing, but inside his mind ran circles. Why was she alone? Why barefoot in the snow? Was there someone waiting just beyond the tree line to finish what she'd started? He froze, listening. Only the hiss of wind at the shutters. Only the pop of pine wood on the fire. No hoofbeats, no voices. But his instincts never quieted. Suspicion had kept him breathing long after other men were in the ground. That's why. Even now. He set his knife within arm's reach of the rug. He poured hot water into a tin cup, added a pinch of salt and a drop of honey. When he held it out, her hands shook as they reached for it, cold as stone. She lifted it, sipped slow, careful, every swallow trembling down her throat. Her eyes stayed on him, watchful but drained. Saying nothing, Caleb sat back on his heels, a full arm's length between them. He didn't ask her name. He didn't give his. In war he had learned words rarely saved lives. More often, they got men killed. Tonight silence was safer. It stood between them like a wall of breath. Her feet began to flush faintly pink again. He pulled the blanket tighter and leaned back against the wall, eyes on the fire. In him. Two voices fought. One, rough and sharp, warned him to throw her out. Every stranger was a threat. Every act of mercy a knife aimed at his ribs. The other voice, quieter but relentless, reminded him he'd seen too many die in the cold. He could not add one more body to the snow at his own doorstep. Across the room, she stirred, lips parting, voice raw as sandpaper. Please, don't. Then nothing. Caleb glanced at her cracked mouth. The words slipped out like a ghost and vanished into the crackle of flames. He tightened his grip on the tin cup and breathed deep. Night fell fast. Outside, the storm pressed heavier, burying the fence line, howling against the roof. Inside, the cabin felt like a fortress, but only barely. Two strangers sat inside its walls, a man with ghosts of war at his back, and a woman with frost still clinging to her skin. Caleb rose, crossed to the wall, and took down his rifle. He set it on the table, plain in sight, a warning. This was his home. If she had a hidden plan, if she meant to betray him, she'd see he was ready. Her head shifted slightly, eyes following the motion. No fear, no protest, just exhaustion. Either she was too far gone to hide her intent, or there was nothing to hide at all. Caleb couldn't tell, and that uncertainty gnawed at him worse than the cold. He spread another blanket near the hearth and sat down, his knife within easy reach, back against the wall, eyes half closed, but his mind wound tight as wire. Every groan of the timbers, Every whistle of wind through the seams made his pulse jump. Silence in this cabin wasn't peace. It was a trap, ready to snap. And so, through the long night, only 2 strangers remained: one scarred soldier who trusted no one, and one cast-out Apache woman holding on to life in the glow of the fire, surrounded by suspicion, thick as smoke. The cabin was so quiet that the crackle of firewood sounded like gunshots echoing from a distance. Caleb leaned back against the wall, eyes heavy from a night of watchfulness. But he refused to let himself fall fully asleep. The woman beneath the blanket still trembled, lips split and dry, though her skin had regained a hint of color. The fire had bought her life at least until morning. Gray light seeped through the cracks in the shutter. Caleb rose, tossed another log into the flames, then ladled a bowl of beans from the pot and set it in front of her. When he sat down again, she slowly opened her eyes, dark, exhausted eyes but no longer empty. "Eat," Caleb said, his voice low and rough. Not an invitation, a command to keep living. She glanced at the bowl, then at him. Silence stretched. Finally, with trembling hands, she lifted the spoon. She ate slow, small bites, as if she'd been taught not to waste a single morsel. Halfway through, she stopped, set the spoon down. Her cracked lips parted, and this time she wasn't begging. "My name is Nayeli," her voice rasped, but it was clear. Caleb gave a short nod. "Nothing more. I was once the wife of a chief," she went on, eyes fixed on the fire. "They chose me, to carry his line." Caleb's hand clenched against his knee. He didn't speak. He'd seen too many women turned into tools, married for duty, used for legacy, never for love. "But I had no children," she said, her tone flat, as if telling a fact carved into stone. "Season after season, nothing. They called me a curse. They cast me out, into the snow." Her eyes flickered, but no tears came. She didn't cry. She wasn't confessing, she was delivering a verdict already decided. Caleb drew in a deep breath. A heavy sorrow rose in his chest, pressing like a stone. Not cheap pity, something deeper. He had lost. 2. A wife, a child, a family. But his loss had been fate's doing. Hers came from the very hands that once claimed her as their own. "It wasn't your fault," he said firmly. Nayeli lifted her gaze to him, as if she hadn't expected any answer at all. When she heard it, she seemed uncertain what to do with it. Her lips pressed together, then parted again. "They said, the spirits had spoken, that I carried emptiness." Caleb shook his head, eyes sharp in the firelight. "I've seen plenty of men blame women just to keep their pride. That isn't justice, and it isn't truth." Something cracked in the silence between them. The wall of suspicion gave way to a fragile thread of understanding. Nayeli pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her body curling inward, not from the cold this time, but from memory's weight. "I walked 2 days. No shoes, no food. I thought I'd die, but I kept walking, because I didn't want them to be right. I didn't want to vanish like a shadow." Caleb went still. In his mind rose the image a woman stumbling through drifts, leaving blood behind with each step, fighting both death and betrayal from her own people. That kind of strength, he thought, he had never seen. He looked at her hands, thin and shaking slightly. He didn't just see weakness, he saw survival. Someone broken, but not beaten, and the sorrow inside him turned into respect. "You made it here," he said quietly. "That's proof enough they were wrong." Nayeli held his eyes longer this time. They were still shadowed, still guarded, but beneath the layers of exhaustion. A faint light stirred just enough to show that someone had finally seen her as more than a curse. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't a silence of fear. It was the quiet of 2 wounded souls sitting near the same fire, sharing warmth without words. Outside, the snow kept falling, Inside, something had taken root. Not trust, not yet, but the seed of it, born out of compassion and truth. The storm didn't let up, day after day. The wind tore across the ridges, burying the fence line and packing fresh drifts against the cabin walls. But inside, life wasn't smothered. It tightened into small, steady habits, practical rhythms that Caleb and Nayeli were forced to share. In the mornings, Caleb rose early, bundled in wool, and stepped out to shovel snow, feed the cows, and haul water from the shallow well. Each time he opened the door, the cold rushed in like a blade. But when he returned, the fire was always alive. Nayeli had added wood in his absence. She still limped, her strength not yet returned. But her hands were never idle. Sometimes she peeled potatoes. Sometimes she scrubbed the table clean. Sometimes she mended scraps of old cloth she'd found in his chest. Meals were plain beans, simmered, bread gone stiff, sometimes a strip of salted meat. They ate facing each other, saying little, the clink of tin spoons their only conversation. But with every day, the silence shifted. It wasn't a wall anymore. It became a space they could bear proof that each still existed, sharing the same warmth. One evening, while Caleb was stacking his axe and tools, he glanced at Nayeli. She was kneeling near the fire, tying kindling into neat bundles. She worked with focus, firelight glinting off her dark features. Caleb gave a small nod, and for the first time spoke words that weren't just commands. You should stay, until the snow breaks. Nayeli froze for a moment, her eyes lifted, black and deep. She didn't answer right away. She studied him, weighing whether his words were a trap or something simple and true. Then she gave the smallest nod. No thanks. No promise. Just a nod. And for Caleb, that was enough. The next day, he spent longer outside, splitting logs and shoring up the chicken coop sagging under snow. When he came back in, he saw Nayeli bent over the pot, stirring beans. She stood more firmly than before, still thin, still worn, but not trembling. Her eyes flicked up at him, calm, then returned to her work. Her presence no longer felt out of place. That night, over supper, Caleb spoke again, firmer this time. If you want, you can stay longer, not just until the thaw. Her spoon paused. She raised her gaze, steady and unblinking. No shock, no burst of emotion, just silence long enough to test if he meant it. Then she lowered her eyes and kept eating. It wasn't refusal. In that quiet, Caleb understood the seed had taken root. The days that followed moved with new rhythm. Caleb split wood. Nayeli bound it in bundles. He cleared the barn path. She spread straw in the stalls. Once, when her leg gave way, Caleb caught her. She didn't push him off, didn't apologize. She just steadied herself and kept on. He saw then a kind of resilience. He hadn't expected strength that wasn't loud, but hard as winter timber. At night they sat near the fire, trading words and fragments. Caleb told of the roof that had caved in 2 winters back, of cattle huddled tight through storms. Nayeli listened, and sometimes answered. Where I come from, women work through the cold the same. Short, clipped, but no longer frozen silence. In the flickering glow, Caleb saw her more clearly. The harsh lines of her face, the weight she carried, but also the way she no longer sat like a stranger. She sat like she belonged. He didn't say it out loud, but inside. He believed it for the first time in 8 years. He could share his space without losing his peace. Outside, the blizzard still howled, but within the cabin, 2 people who had once been utterly alone were now building something together. Resilient, practical, without need for promises. Just the simple knowledge that tomorrow, when the storm rose again, there would be 2 of them sharing the work, sharing the meal, keeping the fire alive. One afternoon, when the snow eased a little and pale light broke through the gray clouds, Caleb stepped into the cabin after splitting wood. He found Nayeli seated by the fire, back straight, face calm. In her hands was the small knife he had left behind, her long black braid, the same he had seen that first night, now hung loose across her shoulders. She lifted the blade and cut. Locks of hair fell to the floor, dark against the rough pine boards like wet ash. Caleb froze where he stood, his fists tightening, not from fear, but from the recognition that something greater was happening. Nayeli wasn't cutting her hair for convenience. She was making a declaration she would no longer carry her past as a burden. When the last strands dropped, she smoothed her hair, now short and even at her shoulders. In the firelight, her face seemed sharper, brighter. She looked up, her eyes steady, asking for no explanation. Caleb only nodded. He understood. This was not weakness. This was strength. After a moment, he turned to the old chest by his cot and drew out something he had not touched in 8 years, a heavy gray coat. The stitching worn, the shoulders patched over and over. It had belonged to Anna, his wife. He set it down beside Nayeli. The cabin went still. Nayeli stared at the coat. She didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she glanced at Caleb. He spoke slowly. "You'll need it more than I do. Out here, the wind shows no mercy." Her hand lifted, trembling not from cold but from the weight of memory. Then she pulled the coat around her shoulders. It hung loose on her frame, but the warmth wrapped her like armor. For the first time since she had stepped into his cabin, she looked protected, not only from the storm, but from the rejection she had carried like a brand. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. It was the first time those words passed her lips. Caleb didn't answer. He only fed another log to the fire. But inside, he knew a bond had tightened. The next day, Caleb dragged old lumber from the shed and laid it out on the snow. He measured, sawed, and framed. At first, Nayeli watched from the porch, arms folded against the cold. Then she stepped down, reached for a hammer, and said, "Let me." Caleb hesitated, but her eyes were unflinching. She wasn't asking for pity. He handed her the hammer. She raised it high and drove it down. The strike was rough, clumsy, but certain. Each blow rang out above the wind, like a vow she wasn't just someone saved, she was someone who would build. For days, they worked side by side. Caleb cut and fitted planks. Nayeli held the boards, drove the nails, wiped sweat from her brow. Sometimes her injured foot faltered, and she bent in pain. But she never quit. She waited, gritted her teeth, then went back to work. The room slowly rose against the cabin wall. Plain, sturdy. Nothing fancy, 4 walls, a sloped roof, a narrow window facing the ridges. But its meaning was clear, a space for her, a sign that she was no longer temporary. One evening, when the frame was finished, Caleb handed her a lantern. "Hang it," he said. She climbed the short step, fixed it to the wooden hook, and lit the wick. The small flame flared, casting golden light over the snow outside. They stood there together, watching. Nayeli touched the rough doorframe, whispering, "This is the first place ever built for me." Her voice didn't shake. It rang like victory. Caleb studied her then, and for the first time, he saw not just a survivor, but a woman unbroken, refusing to let her past dictate her future. The new room stood there, rough-hewn but strong, like the silence between them. Not the silence of suspicion anymore, but the silence of 2 people who would not bow, choosing instead to stand together against the long storm. The snow still fell, but the cabin was no longer just a shelter for 2 strangers. It had begun to feel like a shared home. Caleb noticed the difference in small ways when he came back from the barn. The door was already unlatched when he laid wood on the fire. Nayeli silently passed him another stick when they ate supper. Her eyes no longer drifted away quite so quickly. One evening, after the day's work was done, they sat at the rough-hewn table. Caleb cleaned his knife, while Nayeli slowly brushed the short hair she had cut for herself. The wind outside had quieted, leaving only the steady crackle of firewood. Caleb looked over, and this time, he didn't turn away. Nayeli lifted her eyes and met his. Calm, steady. He set the knife down, rose, and crossed the room. She didn't retreat, in that narrow space between them. Caleb leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. Not hurried, not blazing, but quiet and certain, like both of them knew this was a step that could never be taken back. When he drew back, her eyes shone in the firelight. She whispered, "I'm not leaving." Caleb didn't smile, didn't look surprised. He simply answered, soft and firm, "Good." In that moment, two people who had once lost everything chose a beginning together. That night, instead of curling beneath a separate blanket by the fire, Nayeli walked to Caleb's wide, worn bed. She carried the quilt she had been using and spread it there. Caleb followed, silent, offering no command, no resistance. They lay down, their bodies meeting not out of desperation, but out of choice. His arm came around her shoulders, steady and protective. Their bodies drew close, not with hunger, not with urgency, but with gentleness, an unspoken vow that they were still alive, and no longer alone. The fire burned lower, casting warm bands of light across the rough log walls. In that mingling of light and shadow, they stayed quiet, listening only to the sound of breath weaving together. No vows were spoken, no promises made. Their presence beside each other was answer enough. The next morning, when Caleb shoveled snow in the yard, he felt lighter. The wind still slapped cold across his face, but inside there was warmth he hadn't known in years. When he came back in, Nayeli was boiling water, Anna's old coat resting across her shoulders. The sight didn't cut like it once would have. Instead, it brought a sense of peace, like the past had found its place beside the present. In the days that followed, little things shifted. They still worked as before, but now, when their hands brushed, neither pulled away. At the table, when their eyes met, silence carried more weight than words. One night, as the wind howled outside, Nayeli lay against Caleb's chest and whispered, "I once thought I'd never belong anywhere again." Caleb tightened his arm around her. "You don't have to think that anymore," he said. It wasn't a promise. It was a plain truth, solid as the logs of the cabin walls. In that small wooden room, two people who had lost everything had found steadiness in each other. No longer a woman waiting for the storm to pass. No longer a man closed off in grief. They were companions now, bound by trust, walking together through the long winter. And from that trust, a bond began to take root. Quiet, unspoken, steady as the mountains themselves. That morning, the wind had quieted, brushing against the shutters as if to remind them winter wasn't done yet. Caleb had just come back from the barn, boots heavy with slush, when he saw Nayeli sitting at the table. Her face was still, her eyes fixed on her hands clasped tight in her lap. He set the shovel down, pulled off his gloves. "What is it?" he asked. Nayeli lifted her gaze, eyes bright but tense. Her voice rasped, but it carried weight. "It's been weeks. No bleeding." Caleb froze, his chest tightening. He met her eyes, searching. She gave a slow nod. I carry it now." The fire crackled in the hearth, but the silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Caleb sat across from her, laying his broad hand over hers. No grin split his face, no loud words of joy, only a look solemn, deep, like stone. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Stronger than I thought," Nayeli said softly, her eyes damp. "Something in me feels different, not like before." Caleb's grip tightened. A slow breath left his chest. Inside him rose something unfamiliar, joy edged with fear. But above all, gratitude. He had once buried a child, once watched winter take what little life he had left. Now, with this news, he felt only one need to protect. The days that followed, Caleb worked in silence but with purpose. He reinforced the windows, adding thicker planks against the wind. He sealed the new room, packing fur and the best boards into the cracks. Every strike of his hammer, every cut of his saw was a vow unspoken this house would hold. It would not betray them. Nayeli kept her own rhythm. She sat near the fire, stitching scraps of cloth into small blankets. Her hands, once trembling from cold, moved steady, careful. She wasn't just sewing for a child, she was stitching her own belief that this time, life would not be stolen from her. At night, they sat side by side. Little said, but the silence between them glowed, filled with respect. They both knew they were carrying something fragile, more precious than anything else. One evening, as Caleb poured her a cup of warm tea, Nayeli spoke, "I want my mother to know I live." Caleb studied her. He knew the weight of those words. Her mother, who hadn't been able to shield her when the tribe cast her out, but whose eyes had held grief as she watched her daughter driven into the snow. Nayeli couldn't sever that bond completely. Together they wrote a short letter. Nayeli's hand was firm, unshaking. "I did not die. I live. I have shelter. And I am not alone. Nothing more. Nothing less." She didn't name Caleb, didn't mention the child, only gave her mother the truth she needed. At dawn, they carried the letter to the hollow tree near the trading path, where trappers and merchants often left goods. Caleb tucked it inside a cloth pouch, along with dried meat. They turned back without speaking, their hands locked together. A week later, when they returned, the pouch was gone. In its place lay a folded strip of red cloth, woven tight. Nayeli's hands shook as she lifted it, pressing it to her chest. "She knows," she whispered. Caleb looked at the deep crimson in her hands. No words stitched into it, but he understood. It was an answer, a way of saying she was no longer forgotten, no longer a ghost. Back at the cabin, Nayeli's eyes burned brighter than he had ever seen. In them, Caleb saw faith taking root, strong as the fire they had kept alive through every storm. That night they ate a simple meal of beans, but it tasted different. In that small wooden room, with the red cloth resting on the shelf, they felt as though life had returned, something stolen. Neither spoke it aloud, but they both knew they weren't just surviving anymore. They were beginning to live. Spring didn't arrive in a blaze of sunshine, but in small, patient signs. First came the drip of water from the cabin roof when the midday sun softened the ice. Then the chickens began clucking more, scratching at the patches of bare earth showing through the snow. Finally came the smell of damp soil at the tree line, the scent of wood long buried now exposed again. Caleb stood on the porch, looking toward the Mogollon Ridge, no longer a wall of white, but speckled with green on the slopes. His heart, hardened by years of grief, loosened for the first time in a long while. Inside, Nayeli sat near the new-framed window. Her belly had rounded clearly beneath her plain dress. Her hands still moved with patient rhythm, sewing scraps into something whole. On the shelf above her sat the strip of red cloth her mother had sent a relic, a blessing. Whenever Nayeli looked at it now, her eyes didn't dim with sorrow. They burned with quiet light. The room Caleb had built stood complete now. Once, he had thought of it only as a temporary shelter for her. But as he laid the floorboards, hung a small shelf, and set on it his mother's pine carving beside Nayeli's patchwork. He knew this was no longer a place for the forgotten. This was a family's room. One evening, as the fire painted the log walls gold, Caleb sat at the rough table, tapping his fingers against the worn wood. He looked at Nayeli, leaning back in her chair, her hands resting on her belly. She stroked it gently, as if she could already feel the heartbeat within. Caleb cleared his throat, uneasy. "Nayeli," he said quietly. Her eyes lifted to his, calm, waiting. "We've chosen each other already, but I need to say it plain. Will you be my wife?" The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Then Nayeli's lips curved, not a timid smile, but one strong and sure. The smile of someone who had walked through loss and finally knew what she wanted. "I already am," she answered, "because I chose you." Caleb nodded. The weight inside his chest fell away. He stood, set his hand on her shoulder. There was no ceremony, no garlands, no witnesses, only firelight, the whisper of wind outside, and two hearts finally steady beside each other. In the weeks that followed, they lived fully as man and wife. Caleb worked outside mending fences, readying the ground for planting, digging the garden beds again. Nayeli tended the cabin, stitched new clothes, and kept the fire alive. When Caleb came in weary, she was always there by the hearth, her eyes no longer wary, but rooted part of this place, sometimes at dusk. They sat together on the porch, watching the forest shift colors. Caleb spoke of the past of Anna and Samuel, no longer in a voice cracked with pain, but as if closing an old book. Nayeli listened, never interrupting, her hand resting on his. That touch was enough to remind him memory remained, but no longer haunted him alone. As her belly grew, Caleb's hand stayed busy. He carved a cradle from solid pine, shaving each rail with patient strokes. He strengthened the barn roof to be sure the cows would endure another winter. He stacked wood high, close to the cabin wall. Every task, every blow of his hammer, was not just for survival. It was for the child. Nayeli changed, too. The woman who had stumbled barefoot into the snow now walked steady across the wooden floor, her eyes alive with faith. She taught Caleb how to braid Apache twine, how to hum a lullaby in her tongue. She was no longer a shadow of the past, but a woman building a future. One morning, when sunlight streamed thin through the window, Caleb stepped outside, inhaled the damp air, and heard the stream breaking free of ice. He turned back and saw Nayeli standing in the doorway, hand on her belly, her face calm as dawn. In that moment, he knew the cabin was no longer exile. It was home. A place where a man who once ran from the world and a woman once cast out by her own people could stand side by side, waiting for the birth of a child not bound by title, not by ritual, but by choice and love. Friends watching. This is where I turn to you. If you had lost everything, would you have the courage to open your heart and begin again? The way Caleb and Nayeli did. Share your answer in the comments because every word you leave helps keep their story alive one more time. And if you believe that love and choice are stronger than ritual or law, show your support for them by hitting subscribe and sharing this story. Somewhere out there, someone may need to hear that a true home is built not from ceremony, but from hands, from trust, and from hearts. The story of Caleb and Nayeli isn't finished. A child is coming. A family is forming. And the question before them, and before all of us, is this: how do you keep such a fire burning here on the wind-scoured ridges of Mogollon?